You might have seen versions of this headline somewhere. Most family estrangements end in reconciliation. Or perhaps you've seen some of the figures that are behind it. 81% of maternal estrangements and 69% of paternal estrangements are later classified as unestranged. So those figures come from a large American longitudinal study, but they need some careful unpacking, because the researchers measured whether people later become unestranged, but they didn't measure whether trust was restored or whether the relationship was genuinely repaired. And I've definitely seen some headlines and secondary reports call this reconciliation. Now, that probably goes further than the study itself, and it may create false hope or pressure. I'm a chartered psychologist with over a decade of clinical experience in family estrangement. My doctoral research explored women's experiences of maternal estrangement, and I also have my own lived experience, which is a big part of what drew me to this work. So when I'm talking about this, I'm not speaking from some removed academic position. I've sat with many people navigating this, and I've had to navigate parts of it myself. So let me tell you what I've been seeing in my practice. A parent and an adult child, for example, haven't spoken in months, maybe years, sometimes even decades. Then something happens. There's a health scare, a funeral, a birthday, a text message gets sent, a phone call gets answered, and suddenly people around them start breathing a sigh of relief. Oh, thank goodness they're talking again. And everyone, including sometimes the people involved, takes that as a sign that things are better now, or that they're turning a corner, that the estrangement is over. Now, I want to say this really gently, but also very clearly. Talking again isn't necessarily the same thing of having repaired the relationship. So recontact is an event, whereas I see repair as being a process. And sure, I'm not saying they can't overlap, but they are not necessarily the same thing. And so we need to be careful that we don't treat them as interchangeable, because that can set people up for a really painful cycle. And that's why I feel it's really helpful to draw some of these points out into the open, so that hopefully something can change that will lead to more sustained connection. That's what we want. So I'm going to walk you through exactly what I mean by that, because the distinctions do matter enormously, whether you're a parent hoping that your child is going to come back, or you're an adult child wondering whether it's going to be safe to try again. This isn't about arguing against reconciliation in any way, and I'm absolutely not anti-reconciliation. It's such a joy and a pleasure when I do see families reconcile. In fact, it's one of the greatest privileges of the work that I do. What I am, however, is pro-clarity, and I want to help you understand what's happening in your relationship, not tell you what should happen. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to separate out 4 terms that are often used as though they mean the same thing. And that's contact, reconnection, reconciliation, and repair. So contact, this is the simplest one. It just means that some form of communication has occurred. A text, a phone call, showing up at the same family gathering. So contact tells you almost nothing about the quality of the relationship. If anything, we could just say it's a data point if you want to put it crudely. Reconnection goes a bit further. It implies some willingness to be in each other's lives again, and that kind of moves beyond the silence. There might be some warmth there, some tentative reaching out. It's a step, and it can feel significant, which it is, by the way, because it is an opportunity for more. But at the same time, reconnection doesn't automatically mean anything has been resolved, which is why it's important to pay attention. Reconciliation is where it starts to get more meaningful. So in my mind, I view reconciliation as involving that there's some mutual acknowledgement of something going very wrong in the relationship, and there's a real shared intention to address it. So you notice the language here. So I tend to view it as being there's a willingness on both sides to engage with the difficult stuff, not just to be pleasant over a family dinner. You see the difference? And then there's repair. And repair is the deepest layer, which is where we all probably want to be. It means the relationship has actually changed, and some real, genuine, heartfelt healing has taken place. So it's not that just that people are trying, but it's that real shifts have occurred in how each party are relating to one another. So it's ongoing, it's sustained, and it requires ongoing sustained effort. And in my experience, it's the most difficult of these 4 layers, if we call it that, to reach. They're not, by the way, universally agreed categories. These are the ones that I've noticed and come up with. And the reason I'm differentiating them this way isn't to be pedantic in any way. It's because I think the distinction matters. And I think it matters because what we mean by reconciliation shapes what we expect from it. So one person may mean we are speaking again, and the other may mean the damage has been understood and the relationship will now feel different. Now, if those expectations remain unspoken, that renewed contact can begin with each person hoping for something very different. So expectations are really important because contact may then be seen as testimony that the relationship is healed before the difficult issues have been addressed. So you're in different places. And then when those old patterns return, which they will do if we haven't really healed and we're not putting that effort in, the disappointment can then feel even deeper. And this is really important because the family may then cycle back into distance and try again without ever reaching that lasting repair. But the bigger issue is that repeated cycles of hope and recontact and renewed rupture make the next attempt feel less safe and less possible. So instead of moving towards lasting healing, a more permanent estrangement can actually begin to take root. So can you see the harm that can do? I hope I've explained that. So it doesn't make renewed contact a mistake, but it does mean our expectations need to be realistic and they need to be talked about and matched by what happens after that contact resumes. So okay, why do people resume contact in the first place? And there are many, many reasons in my clinical experience and the things that I've come across. Some actually have very little to do with the original problem having been resolved or overcome. So there can be hope. You know, everyone has hope, of course, that's a big one. Many people who are estranged from a family member never wanted to be in that situation. And whether you're the parent or the adult child, there's always going to be a part of you that wishes things were different. And when an opportunity for contact arises, that hope can just swoop right in and override all your other instincts. I've created some examples here that I think represent some of the things that I've encountered in my practice that hopefully will bring some of this to life. So let's take an adult daughter. She's in her late 30s, let's say. She's been estranged from her mother for about 5 years. Now that estrangement followed years of emotional dismissal, years of not listening, and a pattern of her mother undermining her parenting decisions. So she's done a lot of work in therapy to understand why she needed to take that distance from her mother. Then her mother is diagnosed with a serious illness. So immediately she goes back. She didn't even have to think about it. That pull of that hope combined with the fear of the loss was enormous. But within several weeks of renewed contact, she's saying, nothing has changed. Mum is already dismissing me as too sensitive. I feel exactly like I did before. Now that's what hope without structural change looks like. It's real, it makes sense, and it can be really disorienting. Guilt is another powerful driver. There's an enormous amount of social pressure around family, and it's on both parents and adult children. Everyone feels it. And I hear a lot of parents and adult children describing stigma, although often sometimes in different ways. And what's interesting is that adult children will often talk about being on the receiving end of judgment, or at least anticipating they will, whereas parents often tell me that they just conceal their estrangement because they're so frightened of being judged. Now this gives us some insight into how isolating stigma can feel, because of course if people feel unable to talk about their situation, they're not going to get support, and that's going to affect their emotional well-being in addition to what's going on. So these kinds of social pressure can really drive someone to reach out, not because the relationship feels like it's moved and healed or feels safe, but because the silence feels so socially impossible. And actually that can push people to reach out, which can do more harm than good, particularly if boundaries have been put in place or requested. So another thing is family events that pull people back into contact. I see that quite often. That can be funerals, weddings, the birth of a grandchild. These are moments that are charged with emotion and social expectation. And they can create a kind of, forced proximity that gets mistaken again for reconnection. So let me give you an example of a situation, for example, with a father. He hadn't spoken to his adult son for several years. That estrangement followed a pattern of conflict, which was around his drinking, which his son felt he refused to acknowledge. So when his own mother passed away, his son came to the funeral, they spoke briefly. Now, Dad interpreted this brief exchange as having turned a corner, but in reality, the only exchanges they'd had were about logistics, like who was sitting where, what time the reception started. There'd actually been no conversation about the things that had driven them apart. But the proximity had felt like progress to Dad, but nothing underneath had moved. Loneliness is another one that deserves some honest acknowledgement too. Estrangement can be profoundly isolating for both sides, especially for parents in particular, and they're aging. If they're alone, they can lose not just their child, but their grandchildren, their role in their family, parts of their identity. It's enormous. Adult children can also lose relationships with siblings or extended family, even a sense of their own family history. And of course, over time, that loneliness may make renewed contact feel preferable, even when the relationship still isn't working, just because the alternative feels too awful. And then there's pressure from other family members, siblings, grandparents, anybody, aunts, uncles, all weighing in. Life is short, you'll regret this, they're your parent, they're your child. And I'm not saying there isn't truth to any of this, because there might be regret later on. We have to think about that and consider that life is short. And sometimes that pressure, absolutely comes from a place of love, or often it does. It comes from a place of love and genuine concern. But also it can come from their own discomfort with the disruption that it's causing in the family system. Either way, it may influence a decision to resume contact that doesn't feel like it's being freely chosen. So none of these reasons are wrong, by the way. They're human, but they're also not the same as the underlying issues having been addressed. And I think this is where the risk is, because estrangements can then recur and deepen. And it's really important to name that honestly and to name it without judgment. So if renewed contact isn't necessarily repair, what does real repair actually look like? That's the burning question, isn't it? And in my clinical work, I've come to kind of think of these particular 5 markers or indicators that I call them. And taken together, I think they can signal that something meaningful has shifted and in the right direction. This isn't a validated checklist, by the way, or a guarantee of repair. It's a working framework that I've kind of noticed and developed, and these markers won't appear perfectly, and they won't appear all at once either. So it's an ongoing thing. But let me share them with you. The first is that the original harm or issues can be talked about openly. Now, this one is foundational in my view. If the thing that caused the estrangement can't be named, discussed, or acknowledged without the conversation shutting down, that tells you something significant, doesn't it? Repair requires that both people can sit with the discomfort of what happened, even when it's terribly painful. Now, let me just again give you another example. Let's think about an adult son who's tried to talk to his mother about the verbal abuse and verbal aggression he experienced growing up. Every time he raises it, she'd say, "I don't remember that, you're exaggerating," or she'd cry and say he was hurting her by bringing it up. He would then feel guilty and drop it. So they were still in contact and they did speak regularly, but the core wound was never being addressed because every attempt was deflected or shut down. Now, that's not repair. I would call that management. Let me tell you about another example here of a mother whose daughter, she'd distanced herself after years of conflict around her critical comments about her weight and her appearance. Now, when they resumed contact, Mum had done significant work in therapy, and she's able to say, "I know that the things I said about your body hurt you. I understand that pushed you away, and I'm genuinely sorry." So, of course, her daughter didn't immediately trust it, and that's fair. But the fact that the topic could be raised and engaged with was definitely, in my view, a genuine starting point. Okay, the second indicator is that responsibility is taken without qualification. Now, this definitely relates to and is linked to the first marker that I talk about, but it is worth separating out because there's a big difference between "I'm sorry you felt that way" and "I'm sorry I did that." One puts the problem on the other person's feelings. whereas the other owns the behaviour. And in my experience, the presence or absence of that distinction tells you a lot about where things really stand. Now, I want to be careful here because accountability isn't always a one-way street. There can be a distribution that is weighted definitely on more on one side, particularly when we think about parents and adult children, because parents had more power in that dynamic when their children were children. So we do have to think about that. But in some estrangements, there are real hurts on both sides. An adult child may have said or done things during the estrangement that were also painful and hurtful to a parent. And a parent may have made real mistakes, but they might have also been unfairly characterised. So all of these things can be true. So we just need to hold all of these in mind, that there may be repairing and healing that's needed on both sides. Right, the third indicator. This is that boundaries are respected consistently. So that is, we don't grudgingly respect them, and we don't respect them with an eye roll. And we don't respect them with that subtle message that you think their boundary is an overreaction either. These things slip in, but we genuinely respect it. So as if it's a normal part of how the relationship operates. And when contact resumes, if those old patterns continue, again, that's important information, isn't it? Because respecting boundaries isn't just about compliance either. And this is an important distinction. It's about understanding why the boundary matters to the other person. That is absolutely crucial, because if, for example, let's say a parent stops sending unwanted gifts because they were told to, but privately, inwardly, they believe their child is being unreasonable. They haven't really integrated the boundary and why it matters. They've just suppressed their behaviour temporarily. And if you do that, it's going to come apart later under stress. You'll be exposed. So we've got to understand and put the effort into understanding. The fourth indicator is that behaviour changes consistently over time. This is where the process piece comes in. So anyone can be on their best behaviour for a few weeks. A phone call can go well, a visit can feel really pleasant and wonderful, but repair shows up in patterns, not in isolated moments. So let's think about, let's say, a mother who stepped back from her adult son after years of crisis connected to his addiction. So the addiction itself wasn't the whole reason. It was the repeated intoxicated calls, the demands for money, the verbal aggression, the expectation mum's going to rescue him whenever things fall apart. So when they reconnected, the first few months felt really, really hopeful. Her son was receiving support, taking greater responsibility, respecting her boundaries, and she started to think, great, we're building something different. Then there was a major setback and a relapse, and the late night calls returned, along with the blame, the pressure for money, and the expectation mum's going to fix the situation. It felt as if the old pattern had taken over again. And, that doesn't mean that this attempt was worthless. But what it does show mum is that, she can relate differently with her son when he's stable. But when things are under pressure, things aren't secure enough to hold under that stress. And that's really useful information. It's painful information, but it's useful. And it helps mum understand what contacts she can manage and which boundaries she still needs. But it doesn't mean the repair is complete. And this is hard because she can love her son, understand the suffering that he's going through with his addiction, while still needing to protect herself from harmful behaviour. So, this isn't about punishment. This is about acknowledging that lasting reconciliation requires change that can be sustained, not just when life's going well. So the fifth indicator, and I think this one's quite telling, is that disagreement no longer threatens the entire relationship. So in many families where estrangement has occurred, there's a history of conflict being all or nothing. We see this quite a bit. Either we agree and everything's fine, or we disagree and someone gets cut off, punished, or given the silent treatment. So genuine repair creates a relationship where two people can see things differently without the whole thing falling apart, where you can say, I disagree with you on this, and both people can hold it without it becoming a crisis. That kind of resilience in a relationship is really, really hard won, and it's one of the clearest signs to me that something has absolutely genuinely shifted. Now, I want to talk about something that comes up often in my work, and it's one of the most painful parts of this whole experience, and that is the returning pattern. So contact has resumed. Maybe things have been okay for a while, maybe even brilliant. And then gradually, or sometimes even suddenly, the old dynamics are back there, showing up again. Defensiveness, boundary violations, dismissal. The comments that land exactly where they always landed before. Now, this is something I often see. And when it happens, some people feel worse than they did during the estrangement itself, because now there's an extra layer, not just the original hurt, but the disappointment of, having things be different And then the self-doubt of wondering whether you should have known better, should I have even made the effort? So I want to address both sides of this quickly. If you're an adult child who went back and the old patterns have returned, I understand there's a temptation to blame yourself or regret trying. I should have known, I was naive, I let my guard down. But trying again isn't foolish. It's really a very human thing to want a different outcome with someone you love. What matters now is what you do with the information that this has given you. And if you're a parent who made a genuine effort, who really wanted to change, you tried, but your child has pulled back, I understand how devastating that can feel. It can feel like nothing you do will ever be enough. And I want to acknowledge there are many, many parents who make real meaningful changes and put so much effort in and still find the relationship doesn't recover. That is an incredibly painful reality to live with. And it doesn't necessarily mean you failed. It might mean the damage was deeper than either of you realised, or that your child needs more time, or that the relationship as it was can't be recreated, which I don't ever think it can, by the way. I think we have to build a new relationship. So, even if something new might be eventually possible, maybe it's not now. And I want to say something about what happens if you need to step back again after trying, because one of the most unhelpful narratives out there is that returning to distance after attempting contact means you failed, that the attempt was a waste. Now, I genuinely don't see it that way. Going back and finding that things haven't changed enough gives you real information. Granted, it's not the information you wanted, but it clarifies something important about what is and what isn't currently possible in this relationship. And that clarity, painful as it will be, can actually be a form of progress. It is a form of progress. If you tried and it doesn't hold, that doesn't mean the effort was pointless. It just may mean the timing wasn't right. It may mean there is more work to be done on one or both sides. It may mean that the relationship in its current form isn't sustainable and needs something different to be imagined. And all of these are legitimate outcomes. So when we talk about reconciliation, we need to be clear about what we mean by it. For one person, reconciliation may mean simply speaking again. For another, it may mean returning to a relationship they had before. For someone else, it may mean building something different with clearer boundaries, greater honesty. And I think that is probably the healthier route to go than trying to recreate something you had before that wasn't working. And those expectations matter, because these are the ones that are going to align you and increase your chances of success. If one person sees renewed contact as proof that everything has been forgiven, but the other sees it as a cautious first step, they may believe they're working towards the same thing when they aren't. A parent may assume their child has returned and the estrangement is now behind them. An adult child may believe they're only testing the water, whether the relationship can feel different. So if those expectations aren't discussed, renewed contact can end up carrying more weight than it can bear, and the old patterns return. Someone pulls away, they try again, and the same cycle begins. And each unsuccessful attempt can deepen the hurt and weaken what little trust remains. And over time, what began as temporary or a cyclical estrangement might become more permanent and enduring. Not necessarily because reconciliation is impossible, but because the contact kept resuming before the conditions for that lasting repair were in place. Whether that's therapy, whatever that is, you need to pay attention to that. So the question I'd encourage you to consider, whichever side of this you are on, are we talking again? And what does reconciliation mean to each of us? What would need to be different this time? And has enough changed for this contact to feel voluntary, respectful and sustainable, even when life becomes difficult? So speaking again may be a beginning, but it isn't by itself proof that the relationship has been repaired. If you know someone who's trying to make sense of reconciliation, renewed contact, or another period of estrangement, you may want to share this with them.